In the summer of 1990, a chartered helicopter carrying 2 passengers and a pilot vanished into the dense wilderness of northern Montana during what should have been a routine transport flight. The aircraft was carrying more than just people that day. Hidden in a reinforced cargo compartment were sealed containers holding $1.8 million in cash. The proceeds from what investigators later determined was a sophisticated money laundering operation that had been running quietly for years. No distress signal was ever transmitted. No wreckage was immediately located. The helicopter, its occupants, and the fortune it carried simply disappeared into the vast expanse of forest and mountain terrain. The official search lasted 3 weeks. Teams scoured hundreds of square miles using ground crews, aircraft, and tracking dogs. They found nothing. Weather records showed severe thunderstorms had moved through the area on the day of the disappearance, with wind gusts exceeding 60 miles per hour and visibility reduced to near zero. Investigators concluded that the helicopter had likely been caught in the storm and crashed in a remote location where the wreckage remained hidden beneath the canopy of trees or buried in some inaccessible ravine. The case was eventually classified as a probable accident with no survivors. The money was written off as lost. Insurance claims were processed. The families of those aboard were left with questions that had no answers. And for over 3 decades, the wilderness kept its secrets. But wilderness has a way of revealing what it has hidden, sometimes in the most unexpected ways. Before we dive deeper into this incredible discovery, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. In the spring of 2023, Park Ranger Sarah Chen was conducting a routine patrol along a seldom-used trail in Glacier National Park when she noticed something unusual protruding from beneath a fallen pine tree. The tree, massive and ancient, had been uprooted during a severe windstorm the previous winter. Its root system, torn from the earth, had exposed a section of ground that hadn't seen daylight in decades. What caught Chen's attention wasn't immediately recognizable as significant. It appeared to be fabric, weathered and discolored by years of exposure to the elements. But there was something about the material that seemed out of place in the natural environment. It was too uniform, too deliberately constructed to be random debris left by hikers or campers. Chen had been working in the park system for over 15 years. She had developed an eye for anomalies, for things that didn't belong in the pristine wilderness she was charged with protecting. This fabric, partially buried and tangled in the root system of the fallen tree, demanded closer inspection. Using a small folding shovel from her pack, she carefully excavated around the material. What she uncovered was a jacket, or what remained of one. The outer shell had deteriorated significantly, but the inner lining remained largely intact. The jacket was clearly vintage, with styling that suggested it was from the late 1980s or early 1990s. But it wasn't the age of the garment that made Chen's pulse quicken. As she lifted the jacket from its earthen tomb, she felt something unusual in the fabric. There were irregularities in the lining, areas where the material felt thicker and stiffer than it should. Running her fingers along the seams, she discovered that the inner lining had been deliberately altered. Someone had sewn additional material into the jacket's construction, creating hidden compartments within the garment itself. Chen's training had taught her to document everything before disturbing potential evidence. She photographed the jacket from multiple angles, noting its position relative to the fallen tree and the surrounding terrain. The location was remote, accessible only by foot and requiring a moderate hike through terrain that most casual visitors would avoid. Whatever had brought this jacket to this place, it hadn't been left here recently. Working carefully with a small knife, Chen opened one of the modified seams. Inside, protected by multiple layers of plastic wrapping, was a folded piece of paper. The paper was yellowed with age but remained legible. What she found wasn't just any document. It was a hand-drawn map, meticulously detailed and marked with coordinates, elevation markers, and notations that suggested intimate knowledge of the local geography. The map depicted an area Chen recognized as being within the park boundaries, but it showed features and landmarks with a precision that went far beyond what any standard topographical map would include. Specific rock formations were marked. Water sources were noted. Even individual trees of unusual size or shape had been indicated with careful attention to detail. But it was the annotations that made Chen realize she had stumbled upon something far more significant than a lost hiker's personal navigation aid. Written in small, precise handwriting were notes that referenced specific dates, times, and what appeared to be grid coordinates. Some of the notations included abbreviations and codes that meant nothing to her, but the overall impression was of a document created by someone with serious purpose and extensive knowledge of the terrain. At the bottom of the map, in slightly larger handwriting, was a date, July 15, 1990. Below that, barely legible due to water damage and age, were the initials DM, and what appeared to be a partial phone number with an area code that Chen didn't recognize. The discovery sent a chill through her. July 1990 was more than 30 years ago, but the date resonated with something she had heard before. Chen had been working in the region long enough to know some of the local history, including stories of aircraft that had gone missing over the years. The wilderness of northern Montana had claimed its share of small planes and helicopters, and not all of them had been found. She carefully refolded the map and secured it in an evidence bag from her pack. The jacket, despite its deteriorated condition, went into a larger bag. Everything would need to be turned over to the proper authorities for analysis and investigation. As she made her way back toward the ranger station, Chen couldn't shake the feeling that she had uncovered something that would prove to be far more important than a simple piece of abandoned clothing. The precision of the map, the deliberate concealment within the jacket's lining, and the date all suggested a story that had been waiting decades to be told. The fallen tree that had exposed the jacket had been growing in that spot for well over a century. Its massive trunk and extensive root system indicated it was one of the old giants that had witnessed the passage of time in ways that humans could barely comprehend. For the jacket to have been buried beneath its roots meant that it had been placed there before the tree's final growth had sealed it away from the world above. Someone had taken great care to hide this map in a place where it would remain undisturbed, perhaps indefinitely. The choice of location suggested knowledge not just of the immediate area, but of the long-term patterns of growth and change in the forest ecosystem. This wasn't the work of someone passing through. This was the work of someone who understood the land intimately and had planned for the possibility that the information might someday need to be recovered. But recovered by whom? And why had it been hidden in the first place? Chen reached the ranger station as the afternoon light was beginning to fade. The discovery weighed heavily on her mind, not just because of what she had found, but because of what it might represent. Maps hidden in clothing, buried beneath ancient trees, marked with dates from over 3 decades ago. This wasn't the kind of thing that happened by accident. As she prepared to file her report and turn over the evidence to the appropriate investigators, Chen found herself wondering what other secrets the wilderness might be keeping. The forest had given up one of its mysteries today, but she suspected that this was just the beginning of a much larger story. Chen's report triggered a response that moved through official channels with surprising speed. The National Park Service forwarded her findings to the FBI's regional field office, where the combination of the date, the location, and the suspicious nature of the concealed map immediately caught the attention of investigators familiar with cold cases from the area. Within 48 hours, Special Agent Marcus Delano was driving through the winding mountain roads toward Glacier National Park. Delano had spent the better part of his career working cases that others had given up on, and something about this discovery felt significant in ways that went beyond a simple piece of abandoned evidence. The 1990 helicopter disappearance had been one of those cases that haunted investigators for years after the official search had been called off. 3 people had vanished without a trace, along with what federal agents suspected was a substantial amount of cash connected to a money laundering investigation that had been ongoing at the time. The timing had never felt coincidental to those who had worked the case. Now, 33 years later, a piece of fabric buried beneath a fallen tree might finally provide the first real clue about what had happened during those final moments before the helicopter disappeared from radar contact. Delano met with Chen at the ranger station and examined the jacket and map under proper lighting conditions. The fabric showed extensive wear patterns, consistent with prolonged exposure to moisture and soil. But the synthetic materials had held up better than natural fibers would have under similar conditions. More importantly, the deliberate modifications to the jacket's construction were clearly visible under close inspection. Someone had taken considerable time and effort to create hidden compartments within the garment. The stitching was precise and professional, suggesting either significant skill in tailoring or access to someone with such expertise. This wasn't a hasty modification made under pressure. This was careful, methodical work done by someone who understood the importance of concealment. The map itself proved even more intriguing under detailed examination. The paper was high-quality drafting material, the kind used by engineers and surveyors rather than casual hikers. The ink had faded but remained legible throughout most of the document. What struck Delano immediately was the level of detail and the apparent accuracy of the geographical features depicted. Using current topographical maps of the area, he was able to confirm that the hand-drawn version matched the actual terrain with remarkable precision. Whoever had created this map had intimate knowledge of the landscape, including features that wouldn't be visible from the air and could only be known through extensive ground-level exploration. But it was the annotations that transformed the map from a navigation aid into something far more significant. The coordinates marked various points throughout the depicted area, some connected by dotted lines that suggested planned routes or pathways. Several locations were marked with symbols that appeared to represent landmarks or reference points, though their exact meaning remained unclear. One set of coordinates, circled in red ink and marked with the notation primary, corresponded to a location approximately 12 miles southeast of where Chen had discovered the jacket. The terrain in that area was particularly rugged, characterized by deep ravines and dense forest coverage that would make ground-based searches extremely difficult. Delano cross-referenced the coordinates with the original search patterns from 1990. The location marked as primary had been outside the initial search perimeter, which had been based on the helicopter's last known position and estimated flight path given the weather conditions at the time of disappearance. The revelation was both frustrating and encouraging. Frustrating because it suggested that the original search had been looking in the wrong area. Encouraging because it provided a specific target for renewed investigation efforts. Agent Delano requested aerial reconnaissance of the coordinates marked on the map. Within a week, a helicopter equipped with advanced imaging equipment was conducting systematic sweeps of the terrain identified in the discovered document. The technology available in 2023 was vastly superior to what had been used during the original search, including ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging systems capable of detecting anomalies beneath the forest canopy. On the third day of aerial reconnaissance, the search team identified what appeared to be metallic debris scattered across a steep hillside in a location that matched the primary coordinates from the map. The debris field was partially obscured by 3 decades of vegetation growth, but the distinctive patterns were consistent with aircraft wreckage. Ground teams were dispatched to the site, though reaching the location required a challenging hike through terrain that explained why the wreckage had remained undiscovered for so long. The crash site was in a natural depression surrounded by dense pine forest, accessible only through a narrow ravine that would have been invisible from most aerial search patterns. What they found exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. The helicopter had come to rest in a configuration that suggested a relatively controlled descent, rather than a catastrophic mid-air breakup. While the aircraft was extensively damaged, significant portions of the fuselage remained intact, including areas where personal effects and cargo would have been stored. The first major discovery came within hours of reaching the wreckage. Scattered around the crash site were the remains of several sealed containers, their contents long since deteriorated or dispersed by weather and wildlife. But embedded in the twisted metal of what had once been the cargo compartment, investigators found fragments of currency, wrapping, and banking materials that confirmed this was indeed the missing helicopter. More importantly, they found evidence that at least one of the aircraft's occupants had survived the initial impact. Personal items were discovered at some distance from the main wreckage, suggesting that someone had been able to move around the crash site after the helicopter came down. Tool marks on portions of the wreckage indicated attempts to extract equipment or supplies from the damaged aircraft. The implications were staggering. For 33 years, investigators had assumed that everyone aboard the helicopter had perished in the crash. The discovery of the hidden map and the evidence of post-crash activity suggested a very different scenario. Someone had not only survived, but had possessed the knowledge and foresight to create a detailed record of the crash location and hide it in a place where it might eventually be found. But if someone had survived the crash, where had they gone? And why had they never attempted to contact rescue authorities or their families? The answers to those questions would prove to be far more complex than anyone could have anticipated. The investigation into the helicopter crash site intensified as forensic teams worked to piece together what had happened in those crucial hours and days following the aircraft's disappearance. The evidence painted a picture of survival that challenged every assumption investigators had held for over 3 decades. Among the personal effects recovered from the wreckage was a damaged leather briefcase that had somehow remained partially sealed despite years of exposure to the elements. Inside, investigators found water-damaged documents that provided the first concrete link between the helicopter's passengers and the money laundering operation that federal agents had been tracking in 1990. The briefcase belonged to David Marcus, one of the 2 passengers aboard the helicopter. Marcus had been a mid-level accountant working for a financial consulting firm in Seattle, but the documents revealed his involvement in a sophisticated scheme to move large amounts of cash through a network of shell companies and offshore accounts. The operation had been far more extensive than investigators had originally suspected. What made the discovery even more significant was a handwritten journal, also found in the briefcase, that documented Marcus's activities in the days leading up to the helicopter flight. The entries revealed that he had become increasingly paranoid about federal surveillance and had been planning what he called an emergency extraction for several weeks before the crash. The journal contained detailed notes about contingency plans, safe houses, and alternate identities. Marcus had clearly been preparing for the possibility that his illegal activities would be discovered and that he would need to disappear quickly. The helicopter flight, according to his notes, was supposed to take him to a remote airstrip where he would board another aircraft bound for Mexico. But the storm had changed everything. The final entry in the journal, dated July 14, 1990, just 1 day before the crash, contained a chilling revelation. Marcus wrote that he suspected one of his partners in the money laundering operation was cooperating with federal authorities. He believed the helicopter flight might be a trap, but felt he had no choice but to proceed with the plan. Agent Delano studied the journal entries with growing fascination. The paranoia Marcus expressed in his writing suggested a man who understood that his world was closing in around him. but it also revealed someone who had planned extensively for the possibility of survival in hostile circumstances. The forensic examination of the crash site yielded additional evidence of post-impact activity. Tool marks on the helicopter's cargo compartment indicated that someone had worked systematically to extract items from the wreckage. Investigators found evidence of a makeshift camp approximately 200 yards from the crash site, including the remains of a lean-to shelter constructed from aircraft debris and local materials. Most significantly, they discovered a series of carved markings on trees surrounding the crash site. The markings appeared to be a primitive navigation system, with arrows and symbols pointing in various directions. Some of the carvings included numbers that corresponded to compass headings, suggesting that whoever had made them possessed at least basic wilderness survival skills. The tree carvings led investigators to another discovery that would prove crucial to understanding what had happened after the crash. Following the marked trail for nearly half a mile through dense forest, they found the remains of a second campsite, this one more elaborate and showing signs of longer-term occupation. Here, buried beneath years of accumulated forest debris, they uncovered a cache of supplies that had been carefully preserved in waterproof containers. The cache included emergency rations, medical supplies, basic tools, and most importantly, several $1,000s in cash that had been separated from the main cargo and individually wrapped in plastic. The discovery confirmed that at least one person had not only survived the helicopter crash, but had possessed the foresight and physical capability to extract resources from the wreckage and establish a sustainable survival situation. The level of organization and planning evident in the campsite suggested someone with significant outdoor experience and survival training. But perhaps the most intriguing discovery at the second campsite was a series of notebooks wrapped in multiple layers of plastic. The notebooks contained detailed observations about the local wildlife, weather patterns, and geographical features. More importantly, they included what appeared to be a day-by-day account of the author's activities and mental state during the weeks following the crash. The handwriting matched samples from David Marcus's journal found in the briefcase, confirming that the accountant had indeed survived the initial impact and had managed to establish a viable survival situation in the wilderness. But the notebook entries revealed a man struggling with both physical injuries and psychological trauma from the crash and his desperate circumstances. In one entry dated August 3, 1990, nearly 3 weeks after the crash, Marcus wrote about his growing realization that rescue was unlikely to come. He described his injuries, which included a broken arm and severe lacerations from the crash, and his efforts to treat them using supplies salvaged from the helicopter's first aid kit. More disturbing were entries that revealed Marcus's deteriorating mental state. He wrote about hallucinations, periods of confusion, and what he described as conversations with the other passengers who had died in the crash. The isolation and trauma were clearly taking a severe psychological toll. But it was an entry dated August 15th that provided the key to understanding why Marcus had created the hidden map found in the jacket. He wrote about his decision to leave the crash site and attempt to reach civilization on foot. He understood that his chances of survival were slim, but he also recognized that the location of the crash site and the remaining evidence might be valuable to authorities investigating the money laundering operation. Marcus had apparently spent several days creating multiple copies of the detailed map, hiding them in various locations along his planned route. The map found by Park Ranger Chen was likely one of several such documents, strategically placed in the hope that at least one would eventually be discovered. The notebook entries provided a chilling account of Marcus's final weeks in the wilderness. His handwriting became increasingly erratic as his physical condition deteriorated. He wrote about rationing his remaining supplies, his unsuccessful attempts to signal aircraft he occasionally heard overhead, and his growing acceptance that he would not survive. The final legible entry, dated September 7, 1990, was brief but haunting. Marcus wrote that he could no longer continue and had decided to make one final attempt to reach a location where his body might eventually be found. He included coordinates for a location approximately 5 miles northeast of the crash site, near a distinctive rock formation that he believed would be visible from the air. Armed with this new information, search teams expanded their efforts to include the area Marcus had identified in his final journal entry. The terrain was even more challenging than the crash site, requiring technical climbing equipment to access some of the locations mentioned in his notes. It took another week of intensive searching, but investigators finally located what they believed to be Marcus's final resting place. The skeletal remains were found in a shallow cave beneath the rock formation he had described, along with the remnants of his clothing and a final cache of documents wrapped in plastic. Among these final documents was a detailed confession outlining Marcus's role in the money laundering operation and identifying other participants who had never been caught by federal investigators. The confession provided authorities with enough information to reopen several related cases that had gone cold over the years. But perhaps most significantly, Marcus had included a letter addressed to his family, explaining his actions and expressing his remorse for the choices that had led to his desperate circumstances. The letter revealed a man who understood that his illegal activities had cost him everything, including his life, and who wanted his family to know the truth about what had happened. The discovery of Marcus's remains and his final confession brought closure to one aspect of the case, but it also raised new questions about the fate of the other passengers and the pilot. If Marcus had survived the crash, was it possible that others had as well? And if so, what had become of them? Forensic examination of the helicopter wreckage suggested that the aircraft had been carrying 3 people at the time of the crash, but investigators had only accounted for one set of remains. The mystery of what had happened to the other 2 occupants would require additional investigation and analysis of the evidence recovered from the crash site. The case that had begun with a routine patrol by a park ranger had evolved into one of the most complex and significant cold case investigations in the region's history. The hidden map that had led to the discovery of the crash site was proving to be just the beginning of a story that had remained buried in the wilderness for over 3 decades. As investigators continued to process the evidence and follow new leads generated by Marcus's confession, they began to understand that the 1990 helicopter crash was connected to a much larger criminal enterprise than anyone had previously suspected. The money laundering operation had tentacles reaching into multiple states and involved participants who had managed to avoid detection for years. The wilderness had finally given up its secrets, but those secrets were revealing a web of criminal activity and human tragedy that was far more complex than anyone could have imagined when the helicopter first disappeared into the Montana storm all those years ago. The investigation took an unexpected turn when forensic anthropologists examining the helicopter wreckage made a discovery that would fundamentally alter the direction of the case. While processing debris from the aircraft's passenger compartment, they identified fragments of clothing and personal effects that belonged to not 2, but 3 distinct individuals beyond Marcus himself. The revelation meant that the helicopter had been carrying 4 people, not 3 as originally believed. Flight records from 1990 had listed only the pilot and 2 passengers, but the physical evidence told a different story. Someone had been aboard that aircraft without appearing in any official documentation. Agent Delano cross-referenced the recovered personal items with missing persons reports from the summer of 1990. The search yielded a potential match that sent shockwaves through the investigation team. Among the belongings found in the wreckage was a distinctive silver bracelet engraved with the initials RK and a date from 1987. The bracelet matched the description of jewelry worn by Rebecca Kowalski, a 28-year-old federal informant who had disappeared in July 1990 while working undercover in the money laundering investigation. Kowalski had been providing information to federal agents about the criminal network that Marcus was involved with, but she had vanished just days before the helicopter crash. Her disappearance had been treated as a separate case, with investigators assuming she had either been discovered by the criminal organization or had fled to avoid retaliation. The possibility that she had been aboard the helicopter opened up entirely new avenues of inquiry and suggested that the crash might not have been accidental after all. Delano requested access to classified files related to Kowalski's undercover work. The documents revealed that she had been scheduled to meet with federal agents on July 16, 1990, the day after the helicopter disappeared. She was supposed to provide crucial testimony that would have led to indictments against several high-ranking members of the money laundering operation. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Marcus's paranoid journal entries about suspected betrayal suddenly took on new significance. If he had discovered that Kowalski was working with federal agents, her presence on the helicopter could have been the result of kidnapping rather than voluntary participation. But the forensic evidence suggested something even more disturbing. Analysis of the aircraft's control systems revealed signs of deliberate sabotage. Critical components in the helicopter's navigation and communication equipment had been damaged in ways that were inconsistent with storm-related failure or crash impact. Someone had wanted that helicopter to go down, and they had taken steps to ensure that it would disappear without a trace. The storm that investigators had blamed for 33 years had provided convenient cover for what was actually an act of murder disguised as an accident. The sabotage discovery prompted a complete re-examination of everyone connected to the flight. The pilot, Thomas Chen, had been considered an innocent victim, but deeper investigation revealed financial connections to several shell companies that were part of the money laundering network. Bank records showed large cash deposits to his accounts in the weeks leading up to the crash. The evidence suggested that Chen had been paid to ensure the helicopter never reached its intended destination, but the sabotage had been too effective. Instead of a controlled crash that would eliminate the passengers while allowing him to escape, the storm and the damaged aircraft had created a situation that killed everyone aboard, including Chen himself. As investigators pieced together the final hours before the helicopter's departure, they uncovered evidence of a meeting between Marcus, Chen, and an unidentified third party at a hotel near the airport. Security footage from the hotel, stored in archives that had never been reviewed, showed Marcus arriving with a woman who matched Rebecca Kowalski's description. She appeared to be under duress, walking closely between two men who kept their hands near her arms. The footage confirmed that Kowalski had been taken against her will and forced aboard the helicopter. Her presence on the aircraft had not been part of any planned escape or criminal conspiracy. She had been a victim, kidnapped by the very people she had been helping to investigate. The revelation transformed the case from a story of criminal escape gone wrong into a complex tale of betrayal, murder, and the ultimate price of seeking justice. Kowalski had risked her life to expose the money laundering operation, and that courage had cost her everything. But her sacrifice had not been in vain. The evidence recovered from the crash site, combined with Marcus's detailed confession, provided federal prosecutors with enough information to reopen investigations into dozens of individuals who had escaped justice for over 3 decades. Several arrests were made based on the new evidence, including some suspects who had believed they were permanently safe from prosecution. The $1.8 million that had disappeared with the helicopter was never recovered in its original form. The cash had been scattered across the wilderness by the crash and degraded beyond recognition over the years. But the investigation had uncovered assets worth far more than the missing money, including real estate and investments purchased with laundered funds that could now be seized by federal authorities. For the families of those who died in the crash, the discovery brought a mixture of closure and renewed grief. They finally had answers about what had happened to their loved ones, but those answers revealed a story more tragic and complex than anyone had imagined. Park Ranger Sarah Chen, whose careful observation and thorough documentation had set the entire investigation in motion, was commended by both the National Park Service and the FBI for her role in solving one of the region's most enduring mysteries. The fallen tree that had exposed the hidden jacket was left undisturbed as a natural monument to the persistence of truth and the way the wilderness sometimes reveals what has been deliberately concealed. The case officially closed in late 2023, more than 33 years after the helicopter vanished into the Montana storm. Justice had been delayed, but it had not been denied. The map, stitched into a jacket and buried beneath an ancient tree, had finally led investigators to the truth, proving that some secrets are too important to remain hidden forever. In the end, the wilderness that had concealed the tragedy for over 3 decades had also preserved the evidence needed to expose it. The forest had been both guardian and witness, keeping the story safe until the right person came along to uncover what had been waiting patiently beneath the surface all along.